The Middle East, a land of ancient history, vibrant cultures, and unparalleled religious significance. From the fertile valleys of the Nile to the rugged mountains of Anatolia, this region has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth of religions, and the flourishing of art, science, and philosophy. Yet beneath this rich tapestry of human achievement lies a turbulent reality. The Middle East today is synonymous with conflict, instability, and seemingly perpetual war. This region, once a beacon of knowledge and progress, is trapped in a cycle of violence, its people burdened by the weight of history and the arbitrary lines drawn on maps. But why? Why does this region, home to such rich human heritage, seem destined for perpetual turmoil? The answer, in no small part, lies in the very borders that define its nations. These borders, often drawn with little regard for existing ethnic, religious or tribal realities, have become fault lines of tension, breeding resentment, instability and ultimately conflict. The arbitrary division of people and resources, a legacy of colonial powers and their self-serving agendas, continues to fuel the flames of discord in the Middle East. This is the story of those borders, the conflicts they ignited, and the enduring legacy of instability they have left behind. To understand the Middle East's current predicament, we must journey back in time to an era when empires rose and fell like the tides. For millennia, this region has been a crossroads of civilizations, a battleground for empires vying for control of its strategic location and abundant resources. From the ancient Egyptians and Persians to the Greeks, Romans, and Ottomans, each empire left its mark on the region's cultural and political landscape. These empires, vast and powerful, often ruled with an iron fist, suppressing local identities and imposing their will on diverse populations. However, the seeds of future conflict were sown not just in the rise and fall of empires, but in their demise. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the wake of World War I created a power vacuum, leaving behind a region fragmented and vulnerable. It was into this void that European powers, driven by their own imperial ambitions, stepped in, redrawing the map of the Middle East with little regard for the aspirations of its people. This act of cartographic arrogance, fueled by colonial greed and political expediency, would have far-reaching consequences, shaping the destiny of the Middle East for generations to come. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, a secret pact between Britain and France, stands as a stark example of how colonial powers carved up the Middle East to serve their interests. This agreement, negotiated behind closed doors, divided the Ottoman territories into spheres of influence, laying the groundwork for the creation of new states with artificial borders. These lines, drawn with a ruler on a map thousands of miles away, cut through ancient tribal territories, separated communities with shared histories, and lumped together diverse ethnic and religious groups with long-standing rivalries. The result was a patchwork of nations, often ill-equipped for self-governance and riddled with internal divisions, a fertile breeding ground for future conflicts. The arbitrary nature of these borders ignored centuries-old cultural and religious ties, creating states where different groups were pitted against each other in a struggle for power and resources. This artificial division, a blatant disregard for the region's complex social fabric, sowed the seeds of resentment and instability, setting the stage for decades of conflict and bloodshed. The Sykes-Picot legacy continues to haunt the Middle East today, a stark reminder of the enduring impact of colonial machinations on the region's political landscape. The creation of artificial borders in the Middle East was not merely a historical blunder. It was a catalyst for Western intervention in the region. These interventions, often driven by a complex interplay of geopolitical interests, economic considerations, and ideological agendas, have further exacerbated tensions and fueled the cycle of violence. The West's thirst for oil, a vital resource concentrated in the Middle East, has played a significant role in shaping its policies towards the region. From supporting authoritarian regimes to intervening militarily, Western powers have often prioritized their own strategic and economic interests, even at the expense of regional stability and human rights. This meddling, often disguised as promoting democracy or combating terrorism, has only deepened the mistrust between the West and the Middle East. The legacy of colonialism, coupled with ongoing Western intervention, has created a vicious cycle, where instability breeds intervention, which in turn fuels further instability. This cycle, unless broken, threatens to perpetuate the cycle of violence and undermine any hope for lasting peace in the region. As the 19th century drew to a close, the once mighty Ottoman Empire, weakened by internal strife and external pressures, teetered on the brink of collapse. For centuries, the Ottomans had ruled over a vast swathe of territory from the Balkans to the Persian Gulf, maintaining a delicate balance of power within their diverse realm. But the empire's grip on power had begun to weaken. Nationalist movements, fueled by a growing sense of distinct identities, emerged within the Ottoman provinces, challenging the authority of the Sultan and demanding self-determination. The rise of these nationalist aspirations, coupled with the empire's declining economic and military might, set the stage for a tumultuous period of change and upheaval. European powers, sensing the Ottoman vulnerability, began to circle like vultures, eager to carve out their own spheres of influence from the crumbling empire. Britain, France and Russia, driven by their own imperial ambitions and competing interests, engaged in a complex game of diplomacy and intrigue, each seeking to secure their own strategic and economic objectives in the region. The fate of the Ottoman Empire, once a dominant force in the Middle East, hung precariously in the balance, as external powers jostled for control and internal divisions threatened to tear it apart from within. Amidst the chaos of World War I, as the Ottoman Empire fought its last breaths, a clandestine agreement was struck that would have far-reaching consequences for the Middle East. In 1916, two diplomats, Mark Sykes of Britain and François-Georges Picot of France, met in secret to divide the spoils of a war that was far from over. Their agreement, later known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, was a testament to the cynical nature of power politics, where the fate of nations and the aspirations of millions were traded like bargaining chips. With the stroke of a pen, they carved up the Ottoman territories into spheres of influence, laying the groundwork for the creation of new states with artificial borders. France was promised control over what is today Syria and Lebanon, while Britain secured influence over Palestine, Transjordan and Iraq. The agreement, shrouded in secrecy and driven by imperial ambition, paid little heed to the ethnic, religious or tribal realities of the region. It was a classic example of colonial cartography, where lines on a map took precedence over the lives and aspirations of the people they were meant to govern. With the Ottoman Empire officially dissolved after World War I, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, initially a secret pact, became the blueprint for the political reshaping of the Middle East. The victorious Allied powers, under the auspices of the newly formed League of Nations, implemented the Mandate system, a thinly veiled form of colonialism, to govern the former Ottoman territories. France and Britain, granted mandates over Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Transjordan and Iraq, assumed the role of trustees, tasked with guiding these territories towards eventual independence. However, the Mandate system, far from being a benevolent endeavour, was marked by contradictions and unfulfilled promises. While the Mandate powers paid lip service to the notion of self-determination, their actions often belied their words. They suppressed local nationalist movements, favoured certain groups over others, and exploited the region's resources for their own benefit. This fueled resentment and resistance among the Arab populations, who increasingly saw the Mandate system as a continuation of colonial rule by another name.
Breaking news.
Section 4. Independence with strings attached. the rise of authoritarianism. The decades following World War II witnessed a wave of independence movements across Asia and Africa, as the old colonial order crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. The Middle East, too, was swept up in this tide of change, with former mandates gaining their independence and emerging as sovereign nations. However, the transition to independence was often fraught with challenges. The artificial borders inherited from the colonial era remained, perpetuating internal divisions and fueling regional rivalries. Moreover, the newly independent states often found themselves saddled with weak institutions, fragile
Breaking
economies,
news.
and a legacy of authoritarianism fostered under colonial rule. In many cases, independence did not usher in an era of democracy and prosperity as hoped. Instead, it paved the way for the rise of authoritarian regimes, often backed by former colonial powers seeking to maintain their influence in the region. These regimes, often characterized by repression, corruption, and a lack of accountability, further exacerbated the challenges facing the Middle East, suppressing dissent and hindering the development of stable and inclusive societies. Section 5. The Price of Division. Sowing the seeds of future conflicts. The arbitrary borders imposed by colonial powers, coupled with the unfulfilled promises of the mandate system, created a fertile ground for conflict in the Middle East. The region, already grappling with the legacy of imperial rule and the challenges of nation-building, found itself increasingly divided along ethnic, religious, and sectarian lines. The forced integration of diverse groups within artificial boundaries, often with competing claims to land and resources, led to tensions and rivalries that spilled over into violence. The struggle for power, influence, and control over scarce resources became intertwined with these pre-existing divisions, further exacerbating conflicts and undermining regional stability. The creation of Israel in 1948, while a momentous event in Jewish history, added another layer of complexity to the region's geopolitical landscape. The displacement of Palestinians and the ensuing Arab-Israeli conflict became a defining feature of Middle Eastern politics, fueling regional instability and drawing in external powers. The stage was set for decades of conflict as the wounds of colonialism festered and the artificial borders continued to serve as fault lines for violence and instability. Section 1. A Land Aflame, the Arab-Israeli Wars. The creation of Israel in 1948, a triumph for the Zionist movement, ignited conflict in the Middle East. The displacement of Palestinians, known as the Nakba, sowed enduring resentment. This war shattered the fragile peace post-World War II. Israel, defending its independence, faced Arab neighbors who saw the partition as an injustice. Subsequent wars, from the Suez Crisis to the Yom Kippur War, entrenched violence and mistrust. The human cost, measured in lives lost and futures stolen, casts a long shadow over the region. Section 2. The Scar of Division, the Palestinian Question. The Palestinian question, unresolved and deeply emotive, remains a festering wound at the heart of the Middle Eastern conflict. The displacement of Palestinians in 1948, their struggle for self-determination, and the ongoing occupation of Palestinian territories have become a rallying cry for Arabs and Muslims worldwide. The site of refugee camps, home to generations born into displacement and dispossession, serves as a stark reminder of the human toll of this enduring conflict. The Palestinians' struggle for a homeland, initially fragmented and lacking unified leadership, gained momentum over the decades. The Palestine Liberation Organization, formed in 1964, emerged as a key player, seeking to unite Palestinians under a single banner and advocate for their rights. The struggle took on various forms, from armed resistance to diplomatic efforts, seeking to break free from occupation and secure a just and lasting peace. However, the road to peace has been paved with broken promises, failed negotiations, and continued bloodshed. The Oslo Accords, signed in the 1990s, offered a glimmer of hope, but their promise of a two-state solution remains elusive. The expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, the ongoing blockade of Gaza, and the persistence of violence have deepened the divide and fueled a sense of despair. Section 3. Beyond the battlefield, the refugee crisis and regional instability. The Arab-Israeli conflict, with its devastating human cost, reverberated far beyond the battlefields. The displacement of Palestinians, creating a massive refugee crisis, destabilized neighboring countries and fueled regional tensions. Jordan, Lebanon and Syria, already grappling with their own internal challenges, absorbed hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees, straining their resources and adding to their social and political complexities. The presence of a large and disaffected Palestinian refugee population in these countries created new sources of tension and instability. In Lebanon, for instance, the influx of Palestinian refugees exacerbated existing sectarian divisions, contributing to the outbreak of a devastating civil war in 1975. The Palestinian refugee camps, often neglected and impoverished, became fertile ground for radicalization, adding another layer of complexity to the region's security challenges. The Arab-Israeli conflict also provided a rallying cry for Arab nationalism and anti-Western sentiment, further shaping the region's political landscape. Leaders like Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt capitalized on the Palestinian cause to bolster their own legitimacy and rally support for their pan-Arabist agendas. The conflict in many ways became a microcosm of the broader struggles playing out in the region. The fight against colonialism, the quest for self-determination, and the struggle for power and influence in a volatile world. Section 4. Oil and power, fueling the flames of conflict. The discovery of vast oil reserves in the Middle East transformed the region's geopolitical significance, bringing both prosperity and conflict. Western powers, reliant on Middle Eastern oil, often allied with authoritarian regimes, fueling regional rivalries and conflicts like the Iran-Iraq War. The Cold War cast a long shadow over the Middle East, turning it into a battleground for proxy conflicts. The superpowers armed their allies, fueling internal conflicts and regional rivalries. The Afghan War exemplified how Cold War rivalries destabilized the region and fueled extremism. The end of the Cold War marked the beginning of a new chapter of Western intervention in the Middle East. The first Gulf War in 1991, launched in response to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, marked a turning point in US involvement. The swift victory emboldened US policymakers, reinforcing the belief in military intervention. However, leaving Saddam in power and imposing sanctions on Iraq created conditions ripe for instability and extremism. The 2003 invasion of Iraq, based on flawed intelligence, further destabilized the region, allowing extremist groups like ISIS to flourish. The invasion plunged Iraq into a sectarian bloodbath, creating a power vacuum for extremists. Western interventions and internal challenges created fertile ground for religious extremism. Groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS exploited grievances to recruit followers and advance their agendas. Section 3. The Forever Wars: Afghanistan, Iraq and the War on Terror. The US-led interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq morphed into protracted and costly conflicts. The invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 soon became bogged down in a protracted insurgency. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 unleashed sectarian violence and chaos, creating a power vacuum for extremist groups like ISIS. These wars drained trillions of dollars and claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Section 4. The price of intervention: blowback and unintended consequences. Western interventions often had unintended consequences, like the rise of ISIS in Iraq and the Taliban in Afghanistan. Interventions in Libya and Syria led to civil wars, humanitarian crises, and the proliferation of extremist groups. Section 5. A region adrift. The perils of perpetual intervention. The Middle East today stands at a crossroads, scarred by decades of conflict and Western intervention. The Arab Spring uprisings briefly raised hopes for democracy but gave way to renewed authoritarianism and civil wars. The US withdrawal has created a power vacuum that regional actors like Iran, Saudi Arabia and Turkey are eager to fill. The Arab Spring uprisings swept across the Middle East, toppling dictators and raising hopes for democratic change. However, the initial promise gave way to a more complex reality, with renewed repression and civil wars. In Libya, the fall of Gaddafi led to chaos and civil war. In Syria, Assad's brutal crackdown ignited a horrific civil war, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. The Syrian civil war quickly escalated into one of the most devastating conflicts of the 21st century. The rise of ISIS added another layer of complexity and horror to the conflict. The war triggered the largest refugee crisis since World War II, displacing millions. The Syrian refugee crisis had a profound impact on European politics, fueling the rise of right-wing populist movements. The Arab Spring and subsequent turmoil created a power vacuum that regional actors like Iran, Saudi Arabia and Turkey exploited. Iran supported Shia militias, while Saudi Arabia bolstered Sunni groups. Turkey sought to carve out its own sphere of influence, intervening in Syria and Libya. This competition for influence further destabilized the Middle East and undermined efforts to find lasting solutions. The Middle East, known for its oil reserves, faces a growing crisis of water scarcity. Climate change and rapid population growth have worsened water stress. Competition for water has become a major source of tension and conflict. The Nile River is a focal point of regional tensions due to Ethiopia's dam project. Water sharing in the Jordan River basin is complicated by political instability. Water scarcity has contributed to social unrest and political instability. In Syria, drought forced farmers into cities, fueling social and economic grievances. The Middle East today stands at a crossroads, grappling with the legacies of colonialism, the failures of authoritarianism, and the scourge of extremism. The old order, characterized by artificial borders and external interference, is crumbling. Can the cycle of violence and instability be broken? Can a new Middle East emerge from the ashes of the old? The answers depend on internal and external factors. Internally, young people recognize the need for change. Citizens demand political freedoms, economic opportunities, and social justice. The Arab Spring showed the yearning for change. Externally, the international community must support peaceful transitions. Investing in diplomacy, development and humanitarian assistance is crucial. Addressing poverty, inequality and climate change is essential. The Middle East has the potential to overcome its challenges and build a brighter future. The borders etched in sand a century ago have become shackles on the region's progress. These lines, drawn with an imperial ruler, have become self-fulfilling prophecies of conflict. They are open wounds on the very soul of the Middle East. Generations consumed by war, societies fractured by sectarian strife, and economies crippled by instability. It is time to acknowledge a fundamental truth: these borders are not sacrosanct. True security lies not in reinforcing these artificial divisions, but in transcending them. Envision a Middle East where cooperation triumphs over conflict, where shared resources foster prosperity for all. This is not a utopian dream, but a necessity, a matter of survival for a region teetering on the brink. It requires leaders who prioritize dialogue over demagoguery and who understand that true strength lies in unity, not division. Imagine a Middle East where water scarcity becomes a catalyst for cooperation, building bridges of understanding and entrepreneurship across borders. The future of the Middle East depends